Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Melissa Beck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Sozosei Foundation. Thank you again for joining us for today's Sozosei Summit Solution Lab, The Promise of Litigation to Decriminalize Mental Illness. I thought it would be helpful to start today with just centering ourselves in what does it mean to decriminalize mental illness and why the Sozosei Foundation is dedicated to that mission. If I could have my next slide. This slide will show you the framework within which we work to reach our goal to end the inappropriate use of jails and prisons for the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness. We feel that the key to reaching that goal is to increase access to mental health care. And as a philanthropic entity, we do that through grant making, convening, and communications. And we have four lanes of strategies: research, arts and communications, access, and scaling what works. Today's convening falls squarely within the access to care lane, and we're talking about using litigation to increase access to care. Can I have my next slide? So we work through convenings because we believe that giving ourselves the opportunity to come together makes us better, stronger, faster, and smarter. Collaboration is key, and webinars like this give us the opportunity to think differently about our work. So just to ground us, we're here. These are all of the convenings the foundation has had since its launch in 2019, and we are right here in the incorrect month of July. It's actually August 1st. I think the summer is going too fast. You can just pretend it's still July. Next slide, please. Going even more granular on today, which is actually August 1st, here's our agenda. I'm here to welcome you, and I'll do some housekeeping in a moment. Then I'll turn it over to Bob, who will be our wonderful moderator with all of our esteemed panelists, and he'll be going through a very quick introduction of everyone. But let's go into the really important housekeeping for today's event. On my next slide, please. So first of all, as you probably see, you are all muted for the duration of this webinar. We will be giving you all the opportunity to place Q&A into your laptops or computers, and those will be fed up to Bob. Sadly, we will not be able to get to all of them. We're so grateful to everyone who gave us questions ahead of time, and we've reviewed those and have tried our best to put them into this discussion. There's going to be a final slide that you'll see, which will give you a QR code through which you can give us your feedback on this webinar. We'll also, of course, email that out as a link. We're going to be having an ASL interpreter, actually two of them with us today. We're so grateful for their participation and helping us to increase accessibility of these important gatherings. The recording of this event will have closed captions. We hit some tech snafus in providing that today, for which we deeply apologize. If you have any trouble, you can reach out to Karen. You'll see her text here, as well as her email address. Again, we're so grateful that all of you are together with us to work toward a future where mental illness will not be a crime. And with that, I'll go off screen and welcome you, Bob, with so much gratitude for taking time to be with us. Bob?
Hello, thank you so much, Melissa. I hope everybody's having a wonderful July. I'm very, very pleased to be part of this gathering and to learn along with everyone about the power of impact litigation and about inventive ways to keep up advocacy as we address the problem of criminalization of mental health issues. I'm pleased to introduce our panel today. I'll go through quickly now, but of course, we'll be speaking with each of them individually. I'm very glad today to be talking with Sarah Gregory, Litigation Counsel from Disability Rights California, who has direct experience with the Alamedas that we'll be talking about today. Kevin Martone, the Executive Director of the Technical Assistance Collaborative, who has a variety of experience on the state and governmental side, which should be a perspective today. Leslie Nafford, who is the Senior Advocate for Disability Rights in California and a mental health consumer, who really has a boots on the ground perspective that is crucial for this conversation. Megan Schuller, the legal director of the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, who will be helping us shortly frame the entire conversation, and Luke Sikinyi from the Alliance for Rights and Recovery in New York City. We're the two of the New York here. Again, another mental health advocate with boots on the ground perspective, but also policy experience. I'm very grateful to everyone. We're an interesting moment here as we come into the talk. I first started reporting on mental health issues in the 1990s, almost straight out of college, and my first longer stories was about the shocking piece of information everyone was talking about, that the largest mental health service in New York City was in fact Rikers Island prison. Today, of course, it's not so shocking. We see in many different respects how mental health services have been relegated to the criminal justice system. We're all living with the tragic results of that, and we're all wondering what to do about it. At the same time, there are other challenges going on. There was an increased stigma about mental health conditions that really is something that advocates fight every day. And there are changes in the Supreme Court frankly that have produced big consequential decisions. The undoing of the Chevron decision and the Grants Pass decision, which allows crackdowns on sleeping in public places. We have a lot going on here and a lot to address, and we'll work to try to include it all. But to frame it all, in the middle of it, we have this very interesting model of progress, which is impact litigation. I wanted to hand things over to get things going to Megan Schuller from the Bazelon Foundation to talk to these issues. And I'll just start, Megan, I'll just ask you point blank, what is impact litigation?
Honor to be here with all of you, and I did just want to first start by thanking Melissa and the Sozosei Foundation for hosting this webinar and supporting our work. Whether it's July or August, we can't do it without you, and are really grateful. We're not going to let that one go. I am, as Bob just said, the legal director of the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman with blonde-ish hair and wearing a black top. So next slide, please. What is the power of impact litigation is a great question. And I think there's going to be a lot of opinions about it that folks will hear today. But I've dedicated my career to disability rights and enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act, primarily through high impact litigation. So that is the lens that I'm coming at this from. And I did that first at the Department of Justice, and now I'm doing it at the Bazelon Center. And just for those who are not familiar with us, the Bazelon Center is an organization that's been around for over 50 years now, advocating for the civil rights, full inclusion, and equality of people with mental health disabilities as well as other developmental disabilities. And to do that, we use every tool in our arsenal. So we do not only litigate. Impact litigation is an important piece of the puzzle here. But we also use policy and grassroots advocacy and public education to really transform public systems. And so you will hear me talking about the power of impact litigation, but also the importance of using that as one of the tools and in conjunction with other tools. So, to more directly answer the question, it has been my experience from DOJ to Bazelon that litigation, when it is done right, can really be one of the most effective tools that we have. And it is a way to achieve transformative change. And the type of change that we're talking about today, change necessary to decriminalize mental illness, which really is massive systemic transformative change that we're talking about. Olmstead versus L.C. or Lois Curtis is a Supreme Court case that I think really drives home the point. And so you'll see here on the slides, there's a picture of Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, who were the plaintiffs in this case. Lois and Elaine are in the center of the one photo of four people. And then you can also see Lois Curtis is just beaming in the center of the other photo, surrounded by a bunch of stuffy lawyers clapping their hands. But it's because this was really a landmark victory. It was a case that shows how you can use impact litigation not only for transformative change, but specifically for the decriminalization of mental illness. Olmstead is fundamental to how we go about doing that in our impact litigation when it is paired with community engagement. So in this case, just for context, the Supreme Court affirmed that the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits the segregation of individuals with disabilities. And honestly, this one case radically changed disability rights. I don't think people at the time really realized the impact, and I think that's important for us to understand when we're talking about litigation. Sometimes we see the fruits down the road, but it was a landmark victory. And because these two women who lived in Georgia and they were hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital, they have mental health and intellectual disabilities, but they remained in that institution long after they had been approved for discharge because there were not sufficient community-based services for them to live in the community. And with those services, they could be released from the institution. This case built on a whole series of earlier cases, and it is a process, right? This was not the first case about the segregation of people with mental illness. But with this one decision, with the Supreme Court weighing in, there could no longer be a dispute that the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to people with mental health disabilities, which was a critical piece of the puzzle. And it ultimately, including all of the, what we often refer to as Olmstead cases that followed, led to tens of thousands of people moving out of segregated housing, moving out of hospitals into their communities, getting jobs, apartments, health care that we just would not have seen otherwise. So that, to me, answers the question of what is the power of impact litigation. Next slide. One of the things we're going to be talking about today that I also want to just sort of table set for is an issue of cycling, which I'm sure many of you have already heard about many times before. For those not familiar, when we refer to cycling, what I'm talking about is that people with mental health disabilities, and let's be clear, disproportionately Black people with mental health disabilities, are frequently cycling in and out of psychiatric hospitals, out of homelessness, jails, and prisons. And that's what we are referring to here when we're talking about cycling today, and is going to come up in one of the cases that we're going to talk about. And this is really the result, even though we're now 25 years later past this landmark Olmstead decision, people with mental disabilities all across the country are facing a new wave of institutionalization, and it is hand in hand with criminalization. There is a growing call for a return to asylums that I think we should all be shocked by and concerned about. And this issue of cycling actually impacts a fairly small proportion of the population, but it is an extremely expensive, high-cost problem for jurisdictions because jails are really expensive to run. Psychiatric institutions are really expensive to run. But there is a solution to break the cycle, which is to provide what we often refer to as the Olmstead services, an array of services like supported housing, employment, mobile crisis response, assertive community treatment, and other community-based mental health services that are far more cost-effective, and they're far more effective in achieving long-term success and stability in the community. But for some reason, throughout the country, we are still struggling to implement these services and are directing needed resources elsewhere. And many jurisdictions are looking to quick fixes like homeless sweeps that don't solve the problem. And in most cases, they frankly make it worse. They perpetuate that cycle, causing people to go into jail, go into psychiatric institutions, and be more likely to then be unhoused when they are released, rather than breaking the cycle. Next slide. So how do we break the cycle? This goes to, how do we use impact litigation? What are we here talking about today? Well, the simple answer, I think, to how can we break the cycle is stop using the criminal legal system as the primary provider of mental health services and the primary means of linkage to care. Litigation, perhaps ironically, since we're talking about, let's stop using the criminal legal system, using the legal system through impact litigation can be a means to that end, when paired with policy work, community engagement, narrative change. the reality is that sometimes, the carrot gets rejected and we need a stick. And while, to go back to my tool analogy, you can't build a whole house with just a hammer, but it's also really hard to build one without it. So I think that's where litigation really comes in and can be incredibly impactful. Now, it can be slow. It is not always accessible to everyone, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. It does involve some risk, and it's expensive. But it also leads to proven results. And I want to also just sort of demystify litigation here. It is not really the black box that I think it's sometimes made out to be. Yes, because of confidentiality, there can be stretches where progress is being made behind closed doors. But there's also clear milestones and public wins along the way. There's, for example, a motion to dismiss that produces binding legal precedent that helps advance the law and also clarify the obligations of state and local governments, moving the ball forward. Summary judgment is another milestone that can lead to impactful judicial decisions. And then there's discovery, which can be a treasure trove of information. I think so many people don't even know really what discovery is. But this is where both sides are sharing information, and they're required to share information, documents, interview witnesses of their choosing. And through that, you get access to information that is extremely hard, if not impossible, to get outside of litigation. And that can inform the development of the case at hand, but it also sheds light on internal policies, practices, systems, reports, data. It informs future cases, policy initiatives, practical solutions, and potentially even academic research. And academics are actually often involved in these cases in the form of experts who are then provided unprecedented access to data and information to produce really meaty and detailed expert reports on the issues and questions involved. And then, I want to keep us moving, but I also just want to note that the remedies are a really impactful and important piece of this that we'll talk about more with the panel, because the reality is the vast majority of civil litigation settles. And the result is a negotiated resolution that's agreed to by both sides, that can be very detailed and set forth timelines, concrete goals, systems change. It can be monitored by a neutral party and by courts that will ensure that the change actually happens in a feasible but urgent way. And that state and local governments, the systems we're talking about, are held accountable. So the development and implementation of those agreements is where I think really the revolutionary change happens, when it's done right, centering the voices of the community and of people with disabilities. Next slide. There's been some reference to the fact that there are some challenges that lie ahead. Looking at the courts today, we are going to lose. Not all the time, not even most of the time, I hope, but losses will come. And we did just suffer, as Bob mentioned, a wave of losses for civil rights in the Supreme Court. But should we therefore pivot away from the courts and impact litigation? In my opinion, absolutely not. Often those losses are just as important, if not more so, for ending criminalization. Sparking a national dialogue about homelessness or about the intersection of race and disability is a win in my book. Creating debate among policymakers about what is effective and humane solutions, that's a win. In the Grants Pass case, there were over 40 amicus briefs filed on the quote-unquote losing side. Few cases brought together siloed advocacy movements together on that scale, united for a common cause. There are already new coalitions and partnerships that have been formed because of that case. New cases will most certainly come of it. And the court only rejected one legal theory. So do we need to get a little more creative? Yes. But I think that civil rights lawyers and disability justice advocates do that best. I mean, we're nothing if not scrappy and resilient because we have to be. And sometimes being forced to pivot leads to a better, stronger legal theory and a better end result. So, slide. With that, I want to turn it back over to you, Bob, and hear from our wonderful panel.
Megan, this was wonderful, just a terrific overview. And there was some good news this year. There was a settlement in the Alameda case, and we'd like to explore that a little bit with Sarah Gregory's help. My next question is for you, Sarah. I'm hoping you can, from a 50,000-foot level, but also as an insider, take us through the Alameda case, its twists and turns, and tell us like how you knew you were making progress along the way. Whether you felt it was productive at every point. What are your thoughts on how things went?
Sure. Thank you, Bob, and hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Gregory, she, her pronouns. I'm litigation counsel at Disability Rights California. And just thank you, Sozosei. I'm really appreciative of this conversation. So I'll provide an overview of the Alameda case, some highlights along the way. Disability Rights California opened an investigation into the County of Alameda in California to take a look at its behavioral health system. For folks who don't know, Disability Rights California is the protection and advocacy system of the state of California. Every state has one. And the protection and advocacy agencies are actually mandated by state and federal law to keep tabs on the places and programs that serve people with disabilities, including in California, county mental health systems, behavioral health services. So over the course of our investigation into Alameda County's behavioral health system, we made several pretty significant and concerning findings, including that people with serious mental illness in the county were being unnecessarily institutionalized on a really broad and systemic scale. Large numbers of people were cycling, as Megan talked about, between psychiatric facilities, houselessness, and jail, and due in large part to the county's failure to provide really person-centered, culturally responsive behavioral health services and housing to folks in the community. So we had clients who were taken to the psychiatric emergency room on an involuntary basis, and then just discharged 24 or 48 hours later to homelessness without connections to services, sometimes just getting an Uber ride to a homeless encampment. We had clients who were transferred from the psychiatric ER to jail, where they would then serve a really short, period of time on a really low-level misdemeanor charge, where the core issue was the need for mental health services. We also found really alarming racial disparities in the county that highlighted how these systemic failures disproportionately impact our communities of color. And, in one of our clients, Aziza Ahmad, she spoke about the difference between the treatment she received in the psychiatric ER versus the community services she eventually got. And she said it was the difference between just being kept alive and actually being helped to heal. So these services are crucial and highly impactful. One kind of plot point that I'll mention is that as we were gearing up to file our lawsuit in 2020, the pandemic hit. This is probably a twist in every story of recent history, but the pandemic really hit our clients hard and made this case even more challenging. I'd say in general, one of the major challenges of bringing a lawsuit addressing cycling is staying connected with our clients and our clients' ability to reach their attorneys. Our clients are being uprooted, forced to move around from place to place, often involuntarily. Often they are in the midst of a real crisis, and they're just not in a position to put themselves forward as a plaintiff in a lawsuit addressing systemic change. Staying connected with folks during the pandemic was even harder because we couldn't do what we usually do and go into the community, into the encampments, hospitals, and jails to meet our clients where they are. So given these challenges, Disability Rights California, or DRC, decided to step up and step into the role of the plaintiff in this case. It was the first time in DRC's history that it's done so. And, this really goes to the importance of having an organizational partner in impact litigation to kind of anchor the case and stay the course long term. one other benefit that I see is I think an organizational partner can kind of help shield clients who are in a vulnerable place and let our clients decide how much they want to be involved and how much they want to put themselves out there publicly in the course of the lawsuit. So we filed our lawsuit in federal court in the Northern District of California. We teamed up with a rock star co-counsel team, including my colleagues here at the Bazelon Center, Goldstein, Borgen, Dardarian, and Ho, Aaron Fisher, and the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. We alleged claims under the Americans with Disability Act and related laws under an Olmstead theory. And we demanded that the county change its system to expand its community-based services and provide mental health, substance use, housing services to people in the community so that they can be served where they live and not be forced to enter an institution to get help. One other kind of twist I wanted to mention is that alongside DRC's investigation, the United States Department of Justice had been investigating similar issues in the county. And in April 2021, 3 months after President Biden took office, the DOJ issued a findings letter identifying widespread violations of the ADA due to Alameda County's failure to provide services in the most integrated setting, along with violations in the county jail. And so given the similarity of our claims, we were able to enter into a joint mediation with the DOJ and the County of Alameda to discuss a global settlement. And I just want to say that the U.S. Department of Justice has just been an incredible partner under the Biden administration, and we're just extremely grateful for their work. Yet another reason that elections matter. And after 2.5 years of really hard-fought negotiation, we have reached an agreement addressing services across the behavioral health system. Like many other Olmstead agreements, it addresses, mobile crisis teams, mental health services, assertive community treatment, services for folks with co-occurring substance use. I know that was a question we received, housing and other services. And I'm really pleased to say that the agreement became final in January of this year. It is a public document on our website, Disability Rights California, and is under the jurisdiction of the federal court in California.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I think as we go on, we'll get be able to talk a little bit about how people who aren't actually part of the litigation, how advocates or institutions or even funders can help with efforts like this. But for now, I'd like to turn to Leslie Napper, who has actually been a plaintiff in an Olmstead case, been right at the center in the eye of the storm of impact litigation. And I just thought I would ask you, what is it like to be in the middle of an experience like this?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. Hello, Sozosei. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Leslie Napper. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black woman with a round face, brown skin, and black rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a black jacket or a sweater and working from home. So you'll see various home decor in my background. Thank you for asking. I think in the case you're referring to is the Napper versus Sacramento County case, which is an Olmstead impact litigation case. And as it was a result of what we're experiencing here in Sacramento County. I am a peer advocate, which means that I live with a mental health disability. I live with a serious mental illness, so I identify as, and I was a person who was directly impacted by the 2008, 2009 budget crisis, where the county wanted to shut the doors of our mental health outpatient providers, which would have left me and 6,000 other people who really relied on these critical community-based, voluntary, outpatient provision to maintain our mental health or mental health disability. And for me, I was connected to service team that was culturally responsive. That was critical for me. And so I think it was scary. It was a scary time, but without those services, it was even more scary, right? Because I was at great risk of being reinstitutionalized and or at worst, completing suicide. without those critical services. And so I think one of the pieces, and I absolutely did not want to go back to the psychiatric facility or spend a long time in the ER or be at risk of incarceration or all these other ors, and it was just too much. There was no transition plan for us. There was no discharge planning. None of those things were present at the time. It would have left us incredibly vulnerable, even more vulnerable than we were already. And we're so close to reclaiming our lives back at the time this happened. Then, like now, I think one of the challenges that we had, and I think Sarah spoke to it, was really holding on to the client or staying engaged in the case as a plaintiff, one of the plaintiffs. And so, because we needed our services, we didn't know what's going to happen. Our world is about to be upturned. So much risk in losing our liberty and ability to access the services that we needed. But it was great. So what we did is we advocated. We began to. I gathered my peers and we started going to different local meetings, like the Board of Supervisors, right, or the Mental Health Steering Committee, trying to speak with the decision makers, sharing our stories and letting them see the faces of the people who are directly impacted and hearing our stories and our journey and why these services are so critical for us, right? Including the pieces around housing security. This is what these providers offer to us, along with maintaining our mental illness. But being part of that case was a true exercise in self advocacy, utilizing self advocacy, right? And then also utilizing the civic engagement process, learning through that, trying to understand the limitations of the law, which is a bit of a challenge as well. But really holding on and working truly in co-production as plaintiffs with Disability Rights California and their co-counsel, Cooley LLP and Western Center for Law and Poverty, and along with the Department of Justice to really move this along. And thank goodness for it, because without their partnership, and as you know, as a directly impacted person, um, really stepping up to what's really important to me, right? So that I can live and thrive like everyone else, which is the core of Olmsted, um, is is really important in getting it out there and really sharing our message, changing the narrative around how people are perceiving us living with serious mental illness and what really is needed so that we can thrive in community. And so I'm hoping I'm answering this question, but it made a huge difference. And I'm so grateful for the success of the lawsuit and being a part of it. Um, for without it, I wouldn't be here with you, talking to you today.
Thank you, Leslie. That is so very moving. Toward the end of your answer, you talked about the perception issue, which I think we all ought to talk about a little bit later, about the idea of stigma and the public perception of mental illness. But for now, I'd like to turn to Kevin Martone, who has had a variety of roles on the state side of things. Obviously, there are lots of ways to make change out there. There's grassroots movements, there's direct policy change. I thought I'd ask you, though, about the issue at hand, about impact litigation. How have you seen it used as a tool for policy change in your career? When can it actually be useful to policymakers? When is it most effective?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Hi, everybody. Kevin Martone. I'm Executive Director for Technical Assistance Collaborative. I do a lot of work nationally, sort of in the Olmsted community integration space, and I come at this with you from my experience doing that, but also having been a state mental health commissioner in New Jersey, overseeing a state public system that also had a settlement agreement, as well as just my direct services experience working in community mental health for many, many years. Let me say first, intentional, proactive collaboration between policymakers and advocates and other key stakeholders is essential, and that many good things can occur in systems with that. And it's also necessary when there is litigation to ensure that changes are implemented successfully. Litigation is a tool when those relationships don't exist or there may be significant inertia in systems. Maybe an administration or a department just closes the door or says that it's our way or the highway, or the system perpetuates and sustains segregated settings and systems, even if it's not intentional, or they say they can't do it because of funding or staffing or the legislature. Excuses, right? or when sometimes vested interests have a hold on legislators or policymakers, and they use the threat of litigation to prevent things from changing, right? So a couple of perspectives. If you look at this from the flip side, in systems where you see people stuck in hospitals or nursing homes or board and care facilities or carceral settings, for example, the de facto or implicit policy is that those settings are okay. And it's okay for a person to live there, even if they don't need that type of setting. If we look at the massive amount of police encounters that occur that land people in emergency departments or jail, the de facto policy is that it's okay for police to be the crisis response.
Did we lose Kevin? Okay. For now, though, I'll move it over to Luke, though, from your position as a grassroots organizer and a mental health consumer. You know what is needed for grassroots change to make things for the better. What do you think is most needed right now to support community mental health resources and pump up advocacy?
Yeah, thank you, and happy to be here with Sozosei and all of you. My name is Luke Sikinyi. I'm first and foremost a person in mental health recovery, and then I also have the pleasure of being the Director of Public Policy and Public Engagement at the Alliance for Rights and Recovery, which is a organization that's a partnership between people who use mental health services, peers, and the providers of those services. One of our main goals is really to advance public support for community-based services and advance funding for community-based services. And one of the things that I have seen throughout our work is the things that are really needed to advance that include, that civic engagement that Leslie was talking about before, the activism from people who are using the services, peers, and then really that collaboration, coalition building. I think oftentimes when something big happens or some policies put out and we want to see whether that's even a legal thing to do, one of my first calls is to Megan and other folks over at the Bazelon Center, just to be able to see what you all are thinking about it and how we can kind of attack it from both a policy perspective, but from a legal perspective. So being able to have those resources that, everyone has their niche, their area that they're a true expert in, and being able to rely on each other like that is massive. And I think we need to do more coalition building from a national standpoint. The other and last thing that I think is incredibly important outside of suing folks and having the lawsuits is really that public education piece. And I think part of this kind of touches on what Kevin was saying earlier about having that sort of de facto policy be, people assume that the right thing to do, having police go or being in an institution is okay and acceptable. And a lot of that is because the public doesn't really see what that looks like from inside. They hear about it, and especially when you talk about hospitals, people think about it as, if you break your leg, you go to the hospital, you're there for a week, you're fixed up, and you come back home and everything's fine. But that's not the way it works. And because people don't experience it, they really take what they see in the media as a fact. So you see media campaigns that really only talk about people with mental health challenges as violent or as dangerous and a problem for society at large. They might not use those words, but that's essentially the image that is given. And what that does is that creates this sort of cascade where politicians are hearing that, the public is hearing it, and politicians want to create some quick fix that not only satisfies the public to say that I'm doing something as a politician, but also the media says, okay, we're doing something, and people feel safer because of it. But really what you end up getting is, what we're beginning to see as the fallout of the Grants Pass decision comes. We're seeing California push to bulldoze these encampments because that's the right thing to do in their minds. And I was really disheartened to read comments recently where people essentially alluded to the fact that, even if it's not helping folks, at least people are out of sight. And that really gets at sort of the mentality that we're really dealing with heavily. So I think we really need to take back that narrative and really show people that that is not the case. People with mental health challenges are not the perpetrators of violence. In fact, we are more than likely the victims of violence, and victims not just of personal violence, but state violence, and showing that not only are the ways that we are currently attacking this issue wrong and harmful, but that we have ways that actually do work, and these need to be propagated more so that people get that comprehensive and culturally responsive, personalized care that we know is really needed in a voluntary status, instead of trying to force people into spaces we've known don't work, but because of this desire to, have this image that we're doing something, we continue to do this because of that negative narrative.
Luke, thank you. That's so well put. It's easy to imagine, that community-based mental health services are more effective and even cheaper than the criminal justice system, and yet the public opinion seems to influence politicians to go the other direction. It's also easy to imagine that impact litigation can be kind of a wake-up call to break that cycle. But Kevin, you were cut off before. I thought I'd ask for a final thought from you on that. Is that accurate? Can impact litigation be a wake-up call for policymakers and elected officials who otherwise are being swayed by a stigma?
Yeah, it's, and I think, it's great to hear, Luke and Leslie's perspectives on that, because that really should drive where we're at on things. Sometimes I've been in the room in state budget meetings or, regarding litigation and things like that. Sometimes people who come from a perspective of having good intentions may still not get it right. And that stigma and discrimination are an underlying factor. And, there's a lot of thinking that people still need to be in locked restrictive settings, or can't do this or can't do that. And there's a lot of education that needs to occur there. I've been in rooms, as well with, when we're going through state budget planning meetings with very high senior officials, state treasurers, about, the threat of litigation may not force them to do something, right? They get threatened to be sued on lots of different things every day. But sometimes when you actually get litigation, it can then force that policy, those policy changes. I remember when I was commissioner in New Jersey, if I could just take a minute or two, we used that to really shift where we were at in terms of the types of services that we were able to change. That was even at a time during the recession between 2007 and 2009. So, not only did it sort of help us shift policy, it also protected our budget in many respects at a time when many states were facing significant cuts across the country. And so when I even look at, that's my New Jersey experience, but when I look at litigation and how it's been used in other systems, and this was alluded earlier, many of the big Olmstead settlement agreements across the country for people with serious mental illness, have implementation challenges for sure, but they resulted in thousands of new integrated housing opportunities and services that just wouldn't have occurred without them, even if folks had good intentions. And several of the settlement agreements have not only sort of pushed supported housing and things like that, but are expanding behavioral health crisis services. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that going forward in this landscape.
Thank you, Kevin. I have other questions for our panelists, but I'll be weaving in questions from that have been submitted as well. My next question for you, Megan Schuller, actually dovetails well with a question that came from an audience member. It was about how outsiders like advocacy groups and academics and funders, how they might be involved or even benefit from the materials of the case. The question comes from audience member Sandy Santana. Sandy asks, Sozosei is ahead of the curve in supporting litigation as a tool for systemic transformation. Some funders assess the cost, the timeline, and its adversarial nature, and often shy away, particularly funders who provide support to the very governmental entities being sued. Any advice on how to effectively position this work for funders who may be skeptical and wary?
I am so grateful for that question, because Sozosei is ahead of the curve, and it is so critical to our work. One of the pieces that we've talked about in litigation, for example, is implementation. So, that's a period where a lot of the time lawyers will declare victory, they sign their settlement agreement, and then they don't put in the work, or maybe they don't have the resources and the funding to then really carry the case forward to see it through. And then you run into some of those implementation challenges. Sometimes you have to keep pivoting and negotiating pieces of it as you see what's really working or not. So that is one place where, I think there are opportunities for funders to think about it differently too. If you're scared of the actual, like, in the courtroom part, this is a part where we're collaborating. Now everybody's got skin in the game. We've got an agreement. Let's make it a reality so that it wasn't, a lot of work that then sort of piddles out. I really do think that's critical. But I do hope that part of what this is eye-opening for folks, that this can be really impactful and it's not so scary and it's not such a black box. And honestly, I don't think it's that different than when we're talking about systemic policy change or legislative reform. That happens behind closed doors. There's ups and downs. It takes a really long time to make radical change. Relatively speaking, litigation can be quick in the scheme of, like, overhauling an entire system, making an entire state change its whole mental health service system, and forcing them to find the funding, allocate the funding. And then we as advocates can help with that. We know all about all these different Medicaid funding streams that we can just share and help. And, there's so many different ways that you can get funding for this. There is federal funding available. There's often state funding available. And the advocates know. And so, those partnerships can come through litigation in implementation or through other means when we can work together collaboratively without litigation. But I also just want to return to the mention I made of discovery and how you find all this information. And I think there's ways for us to get scrappy, as I said, be creative. Sometimes, the information shared in discovery has to stay confidential because it involves people's medical health histories. It's very, sensitive information. But there's a lot that is made publicly available. It's in exhibits for summary judgment motions. It is posted in expert reports that often get released. Like, maybe the names will be taken out, but the information is there. A lot of the information in the complaint is the result of a very long investigation, whether it's by the Department of Justice, Disability Rights California, or the Bazelon Center. We've done our homework at that point, and we are laying out all of this helpful information, and we probably have support for it. And folks can come to us, and I think we could have some interesting partnerships and collaborations there too. And that could be, other types of projects that funders could also think about, because it is going to be hard to sustain this work, and especially if we're going to see losses where we're not getting attorney's fees at the end, we're really going to be relying on funders to be able to push this forward, to be able to defend our rights in the courts, which are under attack.
Thank you, Megan. There are lots of great ideas in what you just said about how folks can get involved, and I'll pivot the conversation more toward that in the time we have left as I go through and talking to the other panelists about what is to be done, what can we do to help. I'll start with Leslie Napper as an advocate and plaintiff and mental health consumer. You've talked a little bit about stigma. It seems to me that stigma is at the center not just of the revolving door that we all know about, but also the cycle of bad policy that gets created based on stigma. How can we work to change this narrative? If you could wave a magic wand, what would you wave first? What would you change first?
I love the magic wand question. Combating false narratives and stigma is really important. Like, particularly think of California, right? Care Court, SB 43, Prop 1 passing. I mean, all these things are happening. And really, it's how to change the narrative. Continue to do what we're doing and support this, right? Funding, like, meaningful investment in these voluntary, community-based, culture-responsive mental health services, respite care, peer-run, peer support. These pieces are really important. And so if I had a magic wand, these things, we would have that. We would have meaningful funding for culture-responsive, voluntary, community-based services that are meeting or in neighborhoods where people are, meeting them where they are geographically throughout their counties. If I had a magic wand, we would have those things and not have to worry about SB 43 or not have to worry about the implications of Care Court or law enforcement, like mobile crisis units where we have peers involved. These are things that are really important and are life-sustaining for us in maintaining, learning how to manage our mental illness, and also maintaining our wellness and recovery journey. housing security pieces, not shelters. What's a shelter? I mean, right? Because a shelter is only temporary, not these are things that we really need to invest in to ensure that we're all able to thrive in the community. Why not? Um, and so I think if I had a magic wand, that's what I would hope we would have.
Thank you, Leslie. So Luke, as a grassroots organizer, if someone tapped you on the shoulder after this talk and said, how do I get involved? What can I do? What recommendations would you have?
Yeah, I think the first is really join those, peer coalitions that are advocating. I think getting that, when I spoke about public education before, and I think Kevin really kind of hit this on the head here, getting into the areas where people are making decisions, making sure that you're showing up to those tables, getting to those tables. And sometimes you kind of have to force your way to those tables, but you got to be bold and make sure that you're there, because people are going to make decisions about you. And if they're doing it without you, then as well-intentioned as they could be, it could end up being the worst thing possible for us, right? And we want to make sure that not only are we there at those tables to educate politicians and lawmakers about what the right thing to do for us is, but they also kind of need to know that if they do the wrong thing, we'll be there again. And we're going to be a problem. And that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. We need to be loud. We need to also show folks that what recovery looks like, for us, really be able to take back what people think serious mental health challenges look like, and whether or not people can, be recovering in the community and working, and really getting away from that stigma that, we're limited or we need to be institutionalized. I think one of the biggest watershed moments of the last couple of years is when Senator John Fetterman went into left his position for a little bit to seek mental health treatment. And I think that was a really big show to say that, yes, people in the highest levels of our government are also experiencing these same things, but they're still effective leaders, and they're still, just like you and I, trying to get up, do our work, and be as great at that as possible, and then be able to really show the public that these narratives that have been spun about this are just completely wrong, and that these services that we need are needed because we know they work, and we know that they are helpful while also empowering us to be the best people we can be.
Thank you, Luke. That's a terrific perspective and a great example there. Kevin, I'll put the what is to be done question to you with an eye toward implementation. When settlements and policy changes happen, of course, they need funding and they need political goodwill. Is there a role for funders and advocacy groups and educational institutions for us outsiders to make sure that implementation happens in the right way?
Yeah, Bob, I mean, implementation to me is where the work begins, right? And it's really, really hard. And I almost want to frame it in like, there's four things that come to mind, and I think it's important for outsiders to think about these things when you're working with systems on implementation and change. Where I see implementation face barriers, there's four things. One is there's a lack of urgency, or there's a need for a sense of urgency. Alameda settlement agreement, for instance, is 3 years long. You're halfway or better done through the first year. And, they go fast. And if there's not a sense of urgency, systems struggle with actually meeting the terms of those settlement agreements and deliverables. It's really, really critical. Number two is leadership. In order for these things to work well, there has to be strong leadership. And folks on the outside need to encourage and press leadership to make sure that there's that sense of urgency, or we're breaking down silos, right? Many people are receiving services from different systems, but if only the behavioral health authority is the named person or named group in the settlement agreement, but you need housing to come to the table, or you need law enforcement to come to the table, or employment, it takes strong leadership to get those folks to come around the table to make the changes. That collaboration piece is really key, and I mentioned that earlier, not only across the different state agencies or systems, but also really to help inform the types of services that are developed and implemented.
Thank you. With that in mind, I'll go back to Sarah Gregory and ask about the Alameda case and settlement specifically. Do you think that there is a role for outsiders in ensuring implementation? And And while I have you, I'll just also ask you what lessons have been learned from Alameda for the next Alameda. What might have to happen different another time?
Sure. Yeah. So as Kevin mentioned, we're about 8 months into implementation of the settlement agreement in Alameda. And so I have been doing some reflecting about, what would I do differently? What should the next case look like? There's a couple things that our team has kind of been thinking about. One has been, as has been mentioned by multiple panelists here, is that litigation is, just one tool, and it must be used in coordination with other efforts, including media strategy that includes people with lived experience, to combat false narratives. Also, coordination with advocates to empower the work that they've already been doing and will be doing long after implementation is over. Finding a role for advocates to engage in implementation to really increase that sense of urgency and ensure that the services are implemented with integrity, and to meet the needs of the community. In Alameda, there is just a wonderfully diverse and effective community of local advocates, and a rich history of organizing. One thing we tried to do in the settlement is to create additional spaces for that organizing and advocacy to happen. So thinking about how to use settlements to kind of empower that work long term. So, for example, we tried to write in stakeholder engagement processes into the settlement agreement. We created terms requiring transparent data reporting, particularly highlighting gaps in service utilization by underserved communities, so that those communities can see where the gaps are and have those public fora to go and advocate in the future, even after the litigation is over. So I think there's more ways to be creative about connecting our advocacy across, other modes, connecting with other allies and partners. And I like to keep thinking about that. The other big piece, I think, looking forward is looking for additional ways to tackle over policing of people with disabilities, particularly our communities of color. The settlement in this case, in the Alameda case, included a broad array of what we call intercept zero remedies, meaning that the remedies we achieved through the settlement are really designed to prevent interactions with the criminal system. However, I think we really need to explore additional ways to fight criminalization when those contacts do happen, when the police are the first on the scene during a mental health crisis. And we need to build in early intervention diversion programs that prioritize connecting people with community services in lieu of arrest or jail. We see a lot of clients being arrested because a crime has allegedly been committed, but the real issue is a need for mental health services. We see clients cycling through jails on low-level offenses related to substance use, trespassing, loitering, use of a shopping cart. These folks should not be going to jail or even having to deal with the citations and court system that are coming out of these homeless encampment sweeps. They should instead be provided the community-based services right off the bat that we've all been talking about. And so I think there's a lot of good programs to look at funding, to look at incorporating into litigation strategies, policy advocacy. Law enforcement assisted diversion is one. Looking at giving law enforcement options for connecting to services in lieu of arrest. A lot of officers, I feel, feel like they have limited tools when they do respond. Looking at funding sobering centers in communities that can be a community-based place for sobering and substance use in lieu of an arrest and jail. Diversion at booking, and also holistic defense, which embeds social workers into public defense teams. So that's another area I see worth exploring and funding in the future, is the over policing and enhancing diversion programs.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We've had questions before the event asking about how best to track litigation throughout the country. Are there people out there willing to file lawsuits in the wake of the Supreme Court decisions. But the one I'll land on is how can people best reach out to lawyers like those at Bazelon and Disability Rights California? How, if they want to reach out and contact you, what's the best way to do that? Megan first and then Sarah.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, you can go to our website, which is bazelon.org. So BAZELON.org. You can email me directly at megan.s@bazelon.org. And, there are also protection and advocacy organizations throughout the country. And Disability Rights California is one of those, but every single state has one. So that's something that's important for people to know about. There's also U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country that do civil rights work. And then there's also the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and they have, an online form that you can fill out to file a complaint. Having been on the other end, having worked for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, those can be very brief. Like, you don't need to have representation. You don't have to write a lengthy complaint. You just fill out the form, write your story in the little box and submit it. And that's another way that people can reach out for support, where you don't have to have lawyers. We do all of our work pro bono. Nobody pays anything. And we really do encourage people to reach out to us. I'll note that we are small and we can't always respond to everyone, but we are tracking all the information, and it does help inform our cases when we are trying to bring these big impact cases.
Thank you. And Sarah, the same question.
Sure, yes. Everything that Megan said, in addition to that, you're welcome to visit Disability Rights California website. It's disabilityrightsca.org. We have an intake line that anybody can call to get help. We have a plethora of resources and publications about your rights as the person with a disability. We can also provide referrals to, we have a really rich community of amazing civil rights firms in California that we can help connect to if DRC can't take the case. I just encourage people to reach out, to connect, and to continue talking about these issues with their colleagues.
Thank you, Sarah. I have another question from an audience member, Len Sandler, who asks, what are the best sources of information and statistics to evaluate the history of arrest, charges, and outcome and placement of persons with mental illness? How do you get started studying this issue? I'll put it to the panel. Whoever answers first gets to answer.
I think this is Leslie, really quickly, if I may. I think there's some we can, collect publicly, like public access, right? There's a wonderful RIPA report that's out too, check it out. RIPA, they has a report that has some data and statistics there that maybe one could use that could support the ask.
Yeah, I could say.
One of the things to consider is, there's national data and things like that, but sometimes the local arrest data is really hard to find, right? And if you have local efforts going on in your communities, and in some communities that have CIT teams, crisis intervention teams, if there's a good, well-functioning crisis intervention team, they also will be working with their community partners on trying to improve the systems. And sometimes you're able to look at local data locally on the number of people who are arrested or diverted and things like that. And you can sort of really try to troubleshoot those issues at the local systems level, but also then have the capacity to raise those to your county or state systems to try to effectuate some of that broader systems change.
That's helpful, Kevin. Thank you.
And I was just going to add, there are some reports out there that can be a good place to start, as has been mentioned. The Bazelon Center did a report with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund on the use of police to respond to mental health crises, has a bunch of data in it with citations that can be useful. We've also done work with Vera Institute, which is a great source for data. And we're often looking to the government, too, so looking at NIH and NIMH. SAMHSA within HHS, they will post information that can be really valuable and helpful. And then through Freedom of Information Act requests. And I will also note that the Washington Post has a useful database where they're also tracking police shootings. And there are ways to go through, and it's something that we have used when we are trying to track the number of people with mental illness, the number of people who are Black with a mental health disability who are ending up very tragically being shot and killed in these encounters with the police.
Thank you, Megan. I can move on, but Sarah, have you had an answer on that? Anything else to offer? I thought I'd drill down into what's happening in the Supreme Court. We have an excellent question here from a questioner named Jeff, who really talks about the double whammy we've just experienced. You have the end of Chevron, which could very well, and is expected to, cause a sort of a withering away of the administrative state, so less will get done to help people. And then there's Grants Pass, which allows for criminalizing more behavior out in the world. So you're less help and more police, essentially, is what we're facing potentially in this future, regardless of who becomes president, although that obviously has an effect as well. Does this demand a change in tactics? Does this demand a new way of doing the jobs that you folks do? If there's someone who'd like to take that first, I'm happy to. I'll bring it to Sarah because she just went through a fight like this.
I think it does require thinking creatively. It makes those collaborations we've been talking about even more crucial. I know people are not giving up, that our legal advocates across the country are becoming even more unified, even more collaborative to think about creative responses to these terrible decisions that will just continue to harm people. And I encourage people to continue doing that. I think litigation is an incredibly creative and powerful tool. If you look at the history of civil rights litigation in this country, it never went away just because we got bad decisions. It shifted, it changed, it became more creative, it looked at alternate forums. And I think that's what will happen here. I'm certainly not giving up. I know my colleagues on this panel and at DRC and other civil rights organizations are just going to continue fighting.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. I would also say, I think one of the big things is really looking to be, as an advocate, much more proactive in that collaboration, but also in finding real policy champions. I think right now we desperately need to have a few great people in legislatures, whether it's state or nationally, that can really carry our water for us a little bit, and then do the work of making sure the other folks get on board. Because I think while these decisions are horrible and they open the way to bad policies, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to actually enact bad policy. We could still go back and say, this is the kind of policy that we should be doing. Whether or not we can do something worse, which doesn't mean that we need to actually do it. So making sure that we're proactive and getting good policy in before we start to see that bad policy come up. But we know that bad policy will be coming. So now is the time to really strike and make sure that we're ready to put the good things in now and prevent the bad things from coming.
We know that the changes that need to happen actually cost the government less and are actually more effective. But on the government side of things, Kevin, I'll ask, is there an effective way of making that case to someone who is battling public opinion and battling a strange court environment?
Yeah, so much of this plays out at the state and local level, right? And organizing that grassroots voice, having that face with state agencies, county agencies, elected officials is absolutely critical. And that systems change is hard. You have the wrong buckets problem. Money's invested in jails, but you want it moved over to another, to the behavioral health system. And that's really complicated. But, those voices are really critical at that level. I do think you can make the economic argument at times. It's cheaper to not put people in state hospitals and jails and serve them in supported housing and things like that. But it is a lift, and you really have to have an organized voice. A quick example, I remember testifying in some legislative committees at the state level, and had some legislators who were not willing to make some changes and were, frankly saying some stigmatizing things, sort of that pendulum swing towards people need to be in more restrictive settings. And I had sort of lined up a bunch of consumers to come testify after me. And I had three consumers, two of them had PhDs and one of them had an M.S.W. And they were peer support specialists. And they got up there and told their stories and were able to sort of help me from my policy position convey to the legislature about why they needed to invest in these more upstream integrated settings versus relying on sort of the old school $300,000 a year per bed in a state psychiatric hospital. So
that's such a helpful framework. When I think about the stigma, it's such a curious thing to think that the John Fettermans or Britney Spearses of the world get attention and a certain amount of compassion from the public, and then there's a lot of fear-based stigma still for the mentally challenged in general. And it seems like bridging that gap might be job one. I mean, I'm optimistic though, because I can remember a time a few presidents ago where one of the only things the parties agreed on was criminal justice reform, and we're actually making some changes, and perhaps that can happen again. But for now, I want to thank our panelists who have been inspiring, frankly, and kick things back over to Melissa Beck with gratitude for bringing us together today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I'm so blown away by the content and quality of this conversation. As I said, as executive director of the foundation, I can't tell you enough how grateful we are for the hard work of all of our grantee partners and allies in the field. My takeaways initially from this conversation is yes, there is a role for litigation in the work to decriminalize mental illness, and litigation matters. As a funder, to all of my funder colleagues who are listening out there, I say, please invest in this work. It is so important. I think other pieces that I guess I think a lot about are there are some pretty serious headwinds ahead. And I am really so relieved to hear the reflections about how advocates and lawyers are locking arms, collaborations are blooming all across the nation, and we're actually getting stronger in the face of those headwinds. So keep it up. And of course, as one of our panelists said, voting matters. I'll leave that there. And I love, Luke, your point about allowing our elected officials to carry our water. Let's all work together, continue to lock arms. Thank you for everything you do. Have a healthy and happy day. And thanks again for joining us.